Hello, I'm Paul Briley, and you're listening to Off the Comma. I'm a human who cares about supporting other humans. On this podcast, we explore all facets of what it means to feel stuck in life. We talk with people just like us who found themselves sitting on a comma and not knowing where to go next. We'll unpack the experience with them, where they've been stuck, what it feels like, what they experienced, and what they learned. My goal is to inspire you by seeing yourself in others. I believe that when we feel more connected and seen, magic can happen. And remember, if you find yourself sitting on a comma in your life, you can also talk to me without a microphone. To explore coaching with me and getting off the comma in your own life, check out my information and book a call with me at offthecomma.com. And I'm also doing something different. I'm curating my own sponsor community, local businesses and professionals who I handpick and who align with our vision here. Be sure to check them out, learn more about them on my website and my YouTube channel. In the meantime, let's get into this week's conversation. All right, everybody. I am back with another episode, this time solo. It's just me this week, no guests. And we're going to do something a little different. It's not entirely different. I've done this a number of times before. We're going to take a little bit of time to do some reflecting and maybe talk about some things that we've learned, not just from the podcast, but that I've learned from kind of my life recently. So this week's episode is all about listening, actually. It's a through line in this podcast. You know, we're here to talk about stories and listen and see what we can learn from people's stories. And so listening really is kind of what this podcast is all about. And I've been noticing that this theme of listening, this through line of listening, has been showing up a lot more in my life recently. And so it occurred to me, like, let me take a little bit of time and let's talk about it. And you know, there's a lot of things to learn about listening out there. There's a ton of content and information and education out there about listening. So there's a lot of people with a lot more expertise about it. This week, we're just going to talk about my experiences, my observations, and kind of what I've learned about listening. We're going to jump into it here in just a few minutes and kind of unpack it. We'll keep the episode a little bit shorter this week. And we're also going to make the episode interactive this week. So one of the things that I'll do differently is interject some personal reflection and some questions for you as the listener. Before we get started, let's actually practice listening. And what I want to do is play a soundbite for you and give you a moment to kind of think about what it is that you hear. So let's take a couple of seconds and let's listen to Wendy, who was actually a guest on episode 8.
Because grief for me had always just been sort of associated with being sad and missing somebody or something, missing like grief and when I got divorced and, you know, grief when I had miscarriages and like typical things that people understand to be grief. But if we don't do the work of looking inward to see what it is that makes us behave the way that we behave, why we choose the people that we choose, like if we don't take a look at that, we're doomed to just keep repeating the same behaviors. And then it's that old quote, right? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
All right. Now that we've heard from Wendy, let's take a couple of moments and I have some questions for you. You can answer these questions for yourself. It may even be helpful for you to replay and listen to Wendy's clip again, if that's helpful. And you can do that with all the clips. We're going to hear a couple of clips in this episode today. But the first question for you is, what did you hear from Wendy? And then the next question is, what stood out most for you? Why do you think that stood out for you? The next question is, what did you feel, think, or even believe about what you were hearing from Wendy in that soundbite? And then lastly, what did you want to do about what you heard from Wendy? So you can answer those questions for yourself. Maybe you're saying the answers to those questions out loud in the car while you're driving. But really think about, you know, as you were listening to Wendy, were you thinking actively about what she was saying or passively about what she was saying? Who were you listening to most, her or your internal thoughts about what she was saying? So that's a little bit of listening and kind of getting started on this episode. So let's unpack it a little bit more. Why listening? Why this episode? Why this first exercise? As I mentioned earlier, listening's been showing up in my life a lot recently. I'm seeing this theme repeat itself. And I've been doing a little bit of speaking and teaching about it a lot lately. It shows up in some of the workshops that I teach pretty regularly. And then I've noticed that some of the other workshops that I'm teaching, if I step back from them, I'm kind of like, oh, wow, I seem to be doing a lot of talking about listening. And I notice that when I talk about listening, or when I incorporate the conversation around listening in other topics or other conversations, it really evokes a lot of reaction from people, a lot of really interesting questions, a lot of observations. There's a lot of things that come up when we talk to people about, or when we talk as people, I should say, about the power of listening and what listening actually means and involves. So I've also seen a big difference um, in listening in my own life over these last couple of years. And I've also noticed that of all the listening skills and all the things that listening entails, there's really three skills that I have underused in my past and in my history. So let's talk a little bit about my story and my history. So many of you who have been listening regularly, or those of you who know me, know that I have had a career as a corporate trainer and as a leader within organizations at different times. But generally, my career has been teaching, training, helping people learn skills, and being with learners in the learning process. And even though that required a lot of instructing and teaching and facilitating, I realized as I was going through my coaching training that I wasn't as good of a listener as I thought I was. And I tended to do some of the things that I hear a lot of people talk about and say. I tended to be rushed. I tended to be in a hurry. There wasn't enough time to listen, or I was kind of doing the whole hurry it up, speed it along. When I would listen to people, I tended to always approach it from the standpoint of what can I fix here? What can I answer for here? What can I solve? Helping people find the answers, or trying to just answer questions. And I spent a lot of time thinking about what it was I wanted to say. What was my response going to be? What was the point that I wanted to make? And I found myself putting myself into the other person's story quite a bit. Now, I say I wasn't as good of a listener as I thought I was. There were plenty of times where I was being a good listener. I just wasn't aware of it. I wasn't as conscious of it. And I wasn't as aware of what the difference was between when I was being a good listener and when I was not being a good listener. And here's some of the things that I've learned. One of the things that I've learned is that I have to slow down, and I have to slow down a lot in order to be a good listener, in order to be a good listener in my work as a coach, in my work as a teacher and a trainer, in creating this podcast and being able to show up for my guests, and also just showing up for the people in my life. I have to slow down. I find it very difficult to be an active listener and an effective listener when I am in a hurry or I'm distracted with hurriedness. So slowing down is one of the things that I realized in order to has helped me be a good listener. The other thing is I had to be intentional about listening and make listening important. So if I am going to be with other people, no matter who it is, no matter what the context is, I realize that if I really want to be present and pay attention, I've got to slow down, and I need to be focused on listening. Hey, I'm going to be meeting up with these folks, or hey, I'm going to be talking to these people on this Zoom meeting, or hey, I just ran into this person in the hallway or on the street, and we're talking, we're conversing. I have to really kind of dial in and make listening an objective here. Another thing that I've learned for myself, particularly with the podcast, since we do a lot of sharing stories, my guests share their stories, is that no matter what is going on inside of me, no matter what my reactions are, no matter what I'm thinking, or what's going on in my head, is that it's their story, it's not mine. And so I've really learned a lot about taking my hands off of other people's stories. Here's another thing that's come up for me that I found to be really interesting. And that is just because someone needs me to listen doesn't mean that they need me to do something about it for them. So, a large part of my life, I would listen to people thinking that because they were talking to me about something, that they were actually asking me for help, or they needed me to fix it, or that they needed me to step in and intervene because maybe they weren't aware of the problem that they had, or what have you. So I'm learning a lot now at this point in my life that just because somebody needs me to listen doesn't mean that they need me to do something about it for them. And that becomes one of the questions that I ask, as part of the conversation. And here's a big one too. It's not easy, but it's important. I have to set aside fixing, telling, giving advice, and even having an agenda when it comes to listening. Have learned that it's okay to be surprised by what I hear and I learn, and that not everybody is asking me to fix things or to give them advice, um, and that listening doesn't require a reaction or a response. So, those are just some of the things that I've learned about my own listening skills that I find interesting and that makes it worthwhile for me to talk about. I believe. So, for this episode, amongst all the listening skills, I really want to zero in, focus in, and talk about my experience with three of what I consider to be the most underused or my most underused listening skills. And I've been talking about this in other settings and workshops and so forth. And I'm getting a lot of response from people talking about these three listening skills. So, what are the three listening skills I'm going to be talking about? The first one is reflecting. And I'm going to unpack each of these in more detail. So, reflecting. Second one is acknowledging. And the third one is asking questions with curiosity. Now, I think, no, I believe that if you've been listening to the podcast, you'll see that I use these skills in the podcast. I have strived to use these skills as part of the podcast because these skills actually help us create the intention in this podcast, which is being able to create space for people to share their stories and to be able to let all of the attention and all the focus be on the person telling the story. You'll see in the podcast that I interact and I'm involved with the listener, but I am not trying to extract their story and turn it into something for myself. From time to time, I might ask questions or I might self reference. But overall, these three skills, reflecting, acknowledging, and asking curious questions, helps keep the emphasis and the importance on the story being told by the storyteller. There's lots of other listening skills. I'm focusing on these three, as I said, and I believe that developing these three skills in my own life has had a huge impact, and they have helped me become a much more neutral listener. So, let's unpack it. And this is where we're going to start to get into the audience interaction part of this episode. So I'm going to take just a couple of moments and talk about each of these three skills, what they look like for me, and what I've taken from them. So let's start with the first one, and that is reflecting. So when we're listening to other people, when I find myself listening to other people, it's important for me to stay neutral and to keep my attention on the person who's doing the talking. This helps me focus on using reflecting, that is, helps me focus on what is being said to make sure that I'm hearing the content and the substance of what's being said. It can be tough to use this skill because the only thing I'm doing when I reflect is presenting back what I heard. And sometimes that can seem like it's repetitive or kind of like you're parroting or mirroring someone, but it can have a huge effect on the storyteller because it validates that you're listening. It validates some of the things that they've said, gives them an opportunity to respond to things that you're noticing and observing in a way that doesn't require them to answer a question. So it's really a way of demonstrating that you're listening. And the thing about reflecting is that there's no interpreting, there's no fixing, there's no judging here. You really are just sort of being a mirror for the person who's doing the talking. So here's an example. Let me give you an example. Let's just say, for example, that you're talking to someone and they say, I'm so sorry I'm late. There was a backup on the freeway and there was no way to exit for a solid 15 minutes. Okay, so that's what they've said to you, and you were listening to them. So, a couple of different ways you can reflect back what you heard will go as follows, right? So, one is there's like a direct restate, just literally stating it back. So, you're running late because you had traffic. Okay, so that was direct restate. Another way is to paraphrase. So you're kind of rearranging the words or kind of summarizing what it is you believe you heard. And an example of that might be, it sounds like the traffic threw off your schedule. So they didn't necessarily say that, but that kind of is what they said, just in different words, right? A third way that you could reflect is to rephrase what they said, entirely different words, right? And almost an entirely different thought, but it's still built on what they said. So, an example of that might be, boy, your day didn't go the way you planned. Okay. So, not exactly what they said, but it is what they inferred and what they implied. And then a fourth way to reflect might be assumptive, right? So here's an example. It sounds like you didn't plan for traffic when you left, or you sound frustrated, or that sounds difficult for you. So these are all just reflections. I didn't ask a question. I didn't insert my opinion. I didn't interpret or infer, maybe just slightly in some of those techniques. But with reflecting, what I've done is kind of demonstrated that I'm here, that I'm listening, shown the person talking what I've heard. And now they have an opportunity basically to confirm or disprove. Chances are great when you reflect something back to someone, it's going to keep the conversation flowing and it's going to empower and encourage the speaker, right? The person doing the talking. Because what I found is that if I reflect something back in one of these ways, then what ends up happening is if that's exactly what they said and they believe I've been listening, then they just keep rolling, right? We're just tracking. But if I say something that I believe I heard, and that's not exactly what they meant or intended, then they'll take a moment to say, wait a minute, no, that's not what I said. Or they'll take a moment to say, wait, that's what I said, but no, that's not what I meant. So these are very useful techniques for keeping the conversation flowing without it always being about asking questions or answering or solving or fixing. You're just simply mirroring what someone said. So let's take that and put it into practice. Now, what I want to do is play another sound bite. And this one is from Hector, who was on episode 5. And as you listen to what Hector has to say, I want you to think about what you heard. See if you can set aside questions, fixing, judgments, opinions, and just be able to reflect what you heard. And it's okay to rewind and replay the clip.
Holy shit, man. I don't have to do this shit alone. That doesn't mean people have to feel my pain, but I can create a community around me of people that support me, of people that love me, of people that care about me, or that just genuinely want me to see me succeed. Right. And yeah, not doing it alone and being able to reach out, like having the courage to say, hey, man, do you have a second? I just would really appreciate if you can give me like 5, 10, whatever amount of your time so that I can just chat through this.
Okay. Now that you've heard Hector, here's a couple of questions for you. From what you heard, what would you only reflect back to Hector via a reflection, right? What's something that you heard that you want to show him that you heard? What would that sound like? And do that in the car or, with your hands in the kitchen sink, whatever. Next question for you is, what made you choose that thing to reflect? I'm curious, and you might be curious as well. Like, why did that stand out for you? What made you choose that thing to reflect? And then the last question for you is, how easy was it for you to focus only on reflecting back without anything else? This can be one of the most challenging things because a lot of times when we reflect things, we want to immediately go and add something, a thought or an opinion, or we want to immediately go and ask a question. Okay. So that's reflecting. That's skill number one of what I believe to be an underutilized listening skill in my life. Now let's go to the second one, and that is acknowledging. And acknowledging is very similar to reflecting in that it's also neutral. And we avoid self-referencing, we avoid fixing or judging or solving. But now we're going to speak about something that the other person has done or said or felt or experienced or believed. So we get to bring in emotion here. We get to bring in a little bit of kind of testing the waters of what we believe we heard. And it allows us to show that we're hearing on a deeper level, that we're listening on a deeper level. So we're seeing what the person showed us and maybe a little bit more. And when I'm acknowledging someone, I might also be pointing out something that they didn't even see themselves. We heard it, but they didn't necessarily realize that's what they were seeing or saying. So here's an example of how acknowledgement might work. So, for example, someone says, "We got the family back on track after that last fight, and we were able to enjoy our special dinner without any awkwardness. I didn't think we would make it. We got the family back on track after that last fight, and we were able to enjoy our special dinner without any awkwardness. I didn't think we would make it." So there's a lot there that was said, right? There's a lot to kind of unpack. So with acknowledgement and acknowledging, there's a couple of things you can acknowledge. One is you can acknowledge the action or the effort that that person was describing. So an example might sound like, "It looks like your family really put in some extra effort and energy to make this happen." So in that case, the getting it back on track is the thing we're acknowledging. It sounds like y'all kind of recovered. It sounds like y'all were able to get it back on track and that took some energy, right? Another thing you can acknowledge is the experience, right? So an example of that might sound like, "I can see how challenging this fight must have been for you and the family." So it sounds like from what they told us that they were kind of thrown off track. They had to get back on track and that might have taken some effort, might have been challenging, right? So we're able to acknowledge that. Another thing you can acknowledge is the outcome of what they were telling you. So an example of that might be, or sound like, "Being able to enjoy this special dinner must have been a very important goal for you all." So what they had shared with us about the fight and getting back on track and then enjoying their dinner, that must have been important for them, right? So in these acknowledgement examples, we're able to go a little bit deeper. And now instead of just kind of mirroring back what the person has told us, we're actually acknowledging what they've shared and incorporating things like emotion, outcome, experience. So let's take an opportunity to practice it. Now let's listen to another soundbite. And this is a clip from Angela, who was on episode 53. And as you listen to it, replay it if you need to, think about what she's sharing with you and what would you acknowledge? Just acknowledge.
It started with a breakup, and then me really and truly, for the first time in my life, needing people and not knowing how to ask, then finally asking and finding out that people didn't and couldn't show up. And then I said, okay, then wait a minute. So where am I supposed to go with this? Because I've been literally, I said, I've been feeding a community, and I'm feeling starved. I've been feeding a family, and I feel like I'm dying of hunger. And that's when I realized that, wait a minute, Angie, those people are not you.
Okay, now that we're back, and having listened to Angela's story or a piece of her story, I acknowledge that these are just small clips. There's not a whole lot of context here. From what you heard Angela share, what would you acknowledge her for? Only acknowledge. No questions, no advice, no opinions. What would you acknowledge Angela for? And then the next question I have for you is, what made you choose that thing to acknowledge? And then the third question I have for you is, how easy was it for you to focus only on acknowledging without anything else, like asking questions? This can be tough because, again, we have a tendency, I have a tendency to acknowledge something and then want to move directly into a question or move directly into some kind of a statement. Okay, so we've talked about reflecting, we've talked about acknowledging, and now the third, what I believe for myself has been most underused skill is asking questions, but asking questions with curiosity. So I do ask a lot of questions, but often when I'm asking questions, they might be self-referencing, or they might be confirming something about myself, or they might be following some kind of an agenda that I have, something that I really want to ferret out or dig out or uncover. And with asking questions with curiosity, we can actually ask questions in a way that keeps the focus on the other person and keeps our focus on just listening. So it's all about the types of questions you ask and your intention for asking the questions. So when you're thinking about questions to ask other people, one of the things that I've been doing a lot with myself is notice what I'm curious about when I'm listening. So what's standing out for me? What's really prompting the question? And then why am I curious? Like, notice why I'm curious about this. Why do I want to ask that question? And with asking questions with curiosity, it's really all about asking questions that relate to their story, not our own stories, those stories that are happening inside our heads while we're listening. So let's look at an example of asking curious questions. So let's say a friend comes up to you and says, I applied for that loan I wanted so that I could redo the kitchen. They turned me down. I'm really bummed. Okay. So we probably have some thoughts about that, right? And if we've ever been through this experience or anything close to it, we probably are already thinking about what that felt like for us, when we went through that. So to be able to ask questions that keep it entirely on the person who's talking, the storyteller, it's important to think about, what are the questions I'm curious about and why am I curious? So open-ended or exploratory questions are generally a good way to ask curious questions. They're going to create the opportunity for the other person to kind of do some more talking and some more sharing, right? So here are some examples of open-ended or exploratory questions you could ask that keep the focus on them, their story, and what their experience is. So one question you might ask is, what has you bummed out the most? Or another question might be, what other options do you have? Or another question might be, how important is redoing your kitchen? And these are just three little questions. There's 1,000 questions that we could ask this person, right? So the point here is to ask questions that don't steer in the direction of our own agenda, but to ask questions that keep them focused on their story. And another thing, too, when it comes to asking questions is, instead of jumping in to make them feel better, engage them more in their story. So let's listen to another clip. And now let's listen to Matt, who was on episode 30. And let's see what he has to say. And then think about, what questions do you have? What questions are you curious about? And what questions could you ask that would continue to engage him in his story?
At the moment when I was graduating, it was striking me that there is nothing planned for me after this point. Anything that is going to come up in life is something that I'm going to have to drum up for myself. How do I do that? I was not academically motivated. I did not have a good professional skill set. I did not have direction. And I was not sure how to live an adult life, how to drum up all that is involved in an adult life for myself without a path laid out in front of me.
Okay. Now that we've had a chance to listen to what Matt had to say, let's take a moment, and I have a couple of questions for you. From what you heard Matt share, what do you most want to ask him? What are you curious about? What's the thing that you're most curious about having heard Matt's story? Second question then is, what makes you curious about this? And then the next question is, how would you ask Matt the question? So that's the third of the three underused listening skills that I wanted to talk about that I have been finding to be very powerful in my life: reflecting, acknowledging, and asking curious questions. Now, these are all just short examples. These are all just short versions of these techniques. It's really important to remember that even though I kind of unpacked them separately, and you had an opportunity to listen and then kind of ask yourself those questions and practice those techniques, these are also very fluid techniques. And so separating them for the sake of having a conversation is one thing, but putting them into practice, they're generally going to be used very interchangeably and very fluidly. So you probably wanted to acknowledge or reflect something from Matt's example. You probably wanted to ask a question from Hector's example, and you probably wanted to do all three for Angela's example, right? So they're very fluid, they're very flowy. And it's important to acknowledge that when you are truly listening and you're truly focused on that listener, then all of these can be very effective tools that still have nothing to do with solving problems, fixing things, having an agenda, having judgment about somebody's story. So this is one of the reasons I love this podcast so much, is I get to practice all three of these. I don't always do it perfectly, that's for sure, but I get to practice all of these techniques, and I get to learn so much from each guest I have on the show. And I get to learn from listening to myself and how I feel about using these listening techniques with each of my guests. So, as I come back to and start to wrap things up here, what has all of this focus on listening created for me? Why is this so important? What have I gotten from listening? First of all, a greater empathy for others and even myself. Like, I truly have had the opportunity to slow down and learn more from other people and about other people, and in a way that I don't have to do anything with in the moment, like just being there for their story and letting them experience, what they need to experience from telling the story. Of all the stories, we're up to 50. Well, this is episode 56. We're up to 56 episodes now. And of all these stories, the things that I have learned from each and every one of these individuals, these brave storytellers, has been so powerful. So, greater empathy. Also, I have learned to slow myself down. In fact, I even notice right now how fast I'm talking and how much I'm trying to get this episode done in half an hour. But it's just me talking. So I'm not listening right now, but I am listening to myself, and I'm noticing that I'm talking very quickly. But it slows me down when I'm listening. And particularly on this podcast, when we're recording episodes, I get to slow down and just be with the person telling the story. A really big thing, and there's two or three more points I want to make. This is one of them, is an appreciation for others being just who they are, not who I expect them to be. So I recognize that in my life, I have a lot of unspoken judgments about people and who they're supposed to be and who I want them to be and what I believe is the right way to be and what's the wrong way to be and so forth. But man, over the past couple of years, from the changes in the world, listening to the things that are happening in the world, practicing these listening skills, getting involved with this podcast, getting involved with coaching, I have a whole new appreciation for what it means to be human, and, getting further and further away from these hardcore definitions of right and wrong and good and bad. Another thing that I've learned is learning, right? I've learned a lot of things from these people that I've talked to on the podcast. I've learned a lot of things from my coaching clients. I've learned a lot of things from people that I've talked to when I've traveled or just been traveling around in my own town. And I keep learning that there are countless ways for me to look at things beyond the narrow worldview or worldviews that I might have grown up with or experienced in my life so far. And lastly, what I'll say about what listening has created for me is that it's created much deeper connections with people. And this is going to sound really strange, but I'm learning that the deep connections now are equally as important and sometimes more important than trying to set up a deep connection for always. So I talk to a lot of people that I have a deep connection with when we talk, and then I might not talk to them again for a long time. Or some folks, that was it. We talked and then I never see them again. And I used to think that was a bad thing because then I wasn't doing anything to build or maintain that relationship. And what I'm realizing now is that if I connect deeply with you while I'm with you, then that's more valuable to me than worrying about what it's going to be like next week, next year, or ever down the road. Because some of the people that I've only talked to for an hour, some of the people that I've talked to for one day in my life, I've gotten so much out of that encounter. And the fact that I never saw that person again was okay. It's totally okay. So, as we wrap things up and come to a close, I want to leave you with a little bit of self-reflection. So, some questions for you to ask yourself about your listening skills and to think about and listen to what comes up for you. Think about these answers, see what you learn about yourself. Question one is, what could listening more deeply bring you in your life? So, what could listening more deeply bring you in your life? Question two is, where do you believe you need to be listening more deeply? Where do you believe you need to be listening more deeply? Is that to someone else in your life? Is that to your environment, the atmosphere that you're swimming in? Is there something contextual that you need to be paying attention to? Or is that listening more deeply to yourself and what your inner voices, your inner wisdom has been trying to tell you? Question three is, what does it feel like when you are not being listened to? What does it feel like for you when you're not being listened to? So when you're the storyteller and you're talking, what's it feel like when you pick up on the fact that somebody's not listening to you? Think about those questions. And, as I usually talk about in the wrap up to the podcast episodes, replay this, write them down. Maybe if you're a journaler, write this down and do some journaling about it, some reflection, talk to other people about it, see what comes up for you. I hope you found this episode valuable. It's a little different from our traditional episodes, and it is a little different for me because this podcast is not about preaching or teaching or being an expert or giving advice. So, as always, the invitation is there for you to take what you want from what I've shared. This is really based on my own experiences and then some of the things that have been coming up in other contexts for me. But certainly not an expectation that you go out and do anything with this. It's an invitation. And certainly you don't have to take my word for it. Try it out on your own, see what comes up for you, or let it be a prompt for you to go and research something else or something in a different way. Make it your own. As I said, there's not really any experts. You get to build your own expertise based on your own practice. So before we actually close, the last thing that I want to do is in keeping with the spirit of the podcast and the tradition that we do with all of our guests, I want to take a moment to do some acknowledgments. I want to give a voice to, boost, promote some other folks or organizations in my sphere of influence who have had a big impact on me. And each of the three that I want to acknowledge today all have played a big part in my ability to listen and the things that I've learned as a more effective listener. The first one is New Jersey Orators, and their president and CEO, founding member, Eloise Samuels. I've been on the board of directors for New Jersey Orators for the last 6 years. Very proud to have been a contributing board member. And New Jersey Orators is an organization in New Jersey that teaches the art of public speaking to school-age youth from 7 to 18 in Black and Brown communities. And such important work that they do, that we do. And I have seen such a tremendous impact that it has on these young people who, all I can tell you is that being able to stand in an auditorium with all of these powerful young people and see them give presentations and speak publicly in a way that would embarrass some CEOs that I know. I'm not naming any specific names. I'm just saying, like, the powerful skills that they learn from New Jersey Orators, it's amazing. And their ability to become very powerful orators and to communicate so powerfully and engaging in an engaging manner is just truly impressive. And shout out to all of our volunteer coaches, our volunteer board members, and of course, all the tireless efforts of Eloise Samuels, who has been running this organization for 39 going on 40 years. And the work that they do is amazing. Second organization I want to acknowledge is the BIPOC Coach Collective. And by the way, links and descriptions will be in the show notes for these organizations. So I definitely invite you to check them out. And the BIPOC Coach Collective is a group of coaches that I became acquainted with this year through my work with my local professional coaching association, ICF Sacramento, and a colleague of mine, Tina, who referred me to this group for some possible collaborations between our organizations. And this is a coaching collective that creates spaces for coaches who are people of color to be able to do the work that they do in powerful ways and to create a sense of shared community and to lift each other up and to be able to accomplish all of the things that they want to accomplish. And having interacted with this group of coaches a couple of times now, it's just amazing work that they do. So I encourage you to check out their organization as well. And then last but not least, where I learned the most about listening over these past couple of years is through my coach training program. You've heard many people on this podcast talk about this program. It truly is transformative, but that is TCE, Transformative Coaching Essentials, that is run by my coach trainer, Cammie McLaren. And this program is where I obviously learned how to take, my training, teaching, and kind of corporate coaching background and transform it into life coaching the way I'm doing it today. And that program was just amazing for all the skills that I learned and being able to add this other line of practice to my business that is life coaching. But that is also where I learned so much about listening. And that is really where the original seed of inspiration for this episode comes from. And that's kind of where the story begins back in 2021. So thank you again for everything that you have given me, Cammie and TCE. And I encourage all of you to check it out. So that wraps us up for this week. I think I might have gone longer than a half an hour. So anyway, I hope you found something useful in this episode. Until next time, keep listening. What an honor it is for me to witness these powerful stories. I hope you feel the same way too. Think about what you learned from this conversation. What stood out for you? What challenged you? What inspired you? And I encourage you to write it down in some form of journaling and reflection. Surprises can reveal themselves to you when you do this. And if you were moved by today's conversation, pass it along to someone you care about. Let's spread the word. Let's continue to build connection. And if you do discover something you'd like to unpack further, book a call with me and let's talk about it. My links are in the show notes. Be sure to like this episode, follow the podcast here on this platform and social media at Off the Comma, and feel free to comment and interact with these posts and episodes. Check out my website for workshops, events, and my sponsor community. I'm covering the costs of production by curating my own sponsors who align with our vision. Be sure to check them out. They're all powerful people and businesses. Thank you for listening to this episode of Off the Comma. As always, keep noticing and keep listening.